The book of Exodus begins the narrative of the plagues with a scene that is both shocking and deeply symbolic. The Nile, source of life, wealth, and spirituality for Egypt, turns into blood. What once symbolized celebration and prosperity now becomes death, stench, and despair. The first plague is described in Exodus 7 verses 14 to 24. Moses and Aaron, obeying God's command, stretch out the staff over the waters of the Nile in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials. The waters of the river, the canals, ponds, and even the vessels of stone and wood turn into blood. The outcome is devastating. Fish die, the river reeks, and the Egyptians cannot drink the water. This first sign is not just an isolated miracle, but the opening of a cosmic battle between the God of Israel and the deities of Egypt. To grasp the weight of this plague, it is essential to understand the central role of the Nile. Egypt depended entirely on it. Its annual floods fertilized the land, making agriculture possible in the midst of the desert. Without the Nile, Egypt was nothing more than a vast strip of arid land. But the river was more than a natural resource. It was a religious symbol. Among the Egyptian gods was Hapi, the personification of the Nile and fertility. The pharaoh, as the divine representative, was regarded as the one who controlled the waters and maintained the order of creation. Turning the Nile into blood, therefore, struck directly at the spiritual, economic, and political heart of Egypt. In the Bible, blood is the symbol of life, Leviticus 17 verse 11. At the same time, when shed in judgment, it represents death and condemnation. In the first plague, this contrast is evident. The river that sustained life is now a symbol of death. Theologically, it is as if God declared, "You rely on false gods, but I am the Lord of life. Without me, even water turns into death." This reversal reveals God's power to transform what seems secure into a sign of judgment, showing that He alone is the true source of life. Many scholars and archaeologists have tried to explain the first plague through natural phenomena. Some hypotheses suggest that the Nile could have turned red due to toxic algae, like the red tide, observed in many parts of the world. Such algae would kill the fish and contaminate the water, producing stench and making it undrinkable. Another possibility raised by researchers is the unusual increase of red sediments carried by floods, which would tint the waters. Combined with decomposing organic matter, this could have created an appearance similar to blood. While these hypotheses are debated, the biblical text emphasizes not the how, but the when and why. The miracle lies not only in the phenomenon itself, but in the precise timing and purpose of God's intervention. Transforming the Nile into blood affected not only daily life but also Egypt's economy and religion. Without potable water, Egyptians had to dig wells along the riverbanks. The stench and the death of the fish disrupted food supplies and religious rituals. The Nile, once the reason for festivals and religious celebrations, became a source of shame and despair. This was a direct affront not only to the people's survival but also to Pharaoh himself, who was supposed to be the guardian of cosmic order, Marat. The text also notes that the Egyptian magicians replicated the sign, turning water into blood through their enchantments. This raises a question. If all the water had already turned into blood, where did they find water to replicate it? Perhaps they had access to an isolated reservoir. Regardless, the point is clear. Even if they could imitate the miracle, they could not reverse it. The difference between God's power and the magicians lies here. They could worsen the problem, but they could not bring the solution. The first plague demonstrates that God's judgment begins not randomly, but by striking at the very heart of Egypt's trust, the Nile. God confronts idols. Whatever humans place as the source of life apart from Him can be turned into death. God reveals His sovereignty. No empire, even the most powerful of its time, can withstand His power. God distinguishes His people. While the Egyptians suffer, Israel is preserved and prepared for deliverance. Today, we do not live by the Nile, but we have our own modern gods. Economy, science, technology, pleasures, and even people in whom we place absolute trust. The teaching of the first plague is clear. When humans make something their ultimate source of security, they risk seeing it turn into pain and judgment. Just as Egypt had to recognize the fragility of its gods, we too are invited to reflect. What are our Niles? Where do we place our trust? This plague calls us back to the true source of life, God, who not only judges but also restores. If the first plague struck at the heart of Egypt's economy and religiosity, the second brought something that, at first glance, might seem almost curious or harmless: a massive invasion of frogs. But when we read Exodus 8 verses 1 to 15, we realize it was not a simple nuisance. It was a plague that plunged all of Egypt into chaos, despair, and, at the same time, conveyed a profound spiritual message. God commanded Moses to say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go, so that they may serve me." Otherwise, the Nile would swarm with frogs that would invade houses, bedrooms, beds, ovens, and even the kneading troughs. The scenario described is almost suffocating. The frogs, which normally lived along the riverbanks, multiplied on a supernatural scale and began to occupy every space of Egyptian daily life. In Egyptian culture, the frog carried special spiritual meaning. It was associated with the goddess Hecate, represented with the head of a frog. She symbolized fertility, new life, and regeneration. During the Nile's floods, the presence of frogs was seen as a sign of prosperity, since the water fertilized the land and multiplied life. Thus, this plague was a direct blow against the goddess Hecate. What should have been a sign of blessing and abundance turned into a curse and oversaturation. God was showing that even Egypt's sacred symbols were under his control, and what they regarded as a source of life could become an instrument of judgment. Imagine the desperation of being unable to sleep because the bed was full of frogs. Trying to cook and finding frogs inside the ovens. The biblical text paints an almost nightmarish scene. What was once seen as a sign of prosperity, the presence of frogs after the Nile floods, now became unbearable. Daily life was paralyzed. No one could perform basic tasks without being disturbed by the infestation. Here lies the irony. The very creature that symbolized life now brought chaos and impurity. Some scholars suggest that after the first plague, with the river contaminated and the fish dead, the frogs left the water in search of survival and spread across Egypt. This could explain part of the natural aspect of the plague. However, the biblical narrative makes it clear that this was not ordinary. The scale, the invasion of every space, and the exact timing revealed a supernatural dimension. The phenomenon may have begun in a natural way, but it was elevated to the level of a divine sign of judgment. Interestingly, Egypt's magicians were also able to replicate the plague, producing more frogs through their enchantments. But, as in the first plague, this only worsened the problem. They could not reverse the situation, only aggravate it. Faced with the chaos, Pharaoh asked Moses to pray to the Lord to remove the frogs, promising to release the people. Moses interceded, the frogs died, and their heaps filled the land with stench. But Pharaoh hardened his heart once again and went back on his word. This cycle of promises and hardening repeats itself in several plagues, revealing the resistance of the human heart in the face of divine intervention. God often uses irony in his judgments. In the second plague, what was a symbol of blessing became a burden. The goddess Hecate, associated with life and rebirth, was unmasked when the proliferation of her creatures brought chaos and death. Theologically, this irony demonstrates that when humans idolize creation instead of the Creator, what should bring joy can become a source of despair. When blessings become burdens, just as frogs were seen as blessings after the floods, there are things in our lives that, when they exceed their proper limits, cease to be blessings and become heavy weights. Wealth, pleasures, status, power. The fragility of idols. The plague showed that neither the goddess of fertility nor Pharaoh could control the situation. God stood above even Egypt's most sacred symbols. The hardened heart. Pharaoh represents human resistance to God's voice. How many times do people, in the midst of chaos, promise to change? But when the situation improves, they return to their old ways. Today, we may not worship a frog goddess, but we still idolize concepts tied to fertility, productivity, and success. Modern society values multiplication of goods, status, results, as a sign of blessing. But when this accumulation exceeds its limits, it can suffocate us. The second plague invites us to reflect on excess. What should bring life can become oppression when we fail to recognize that only God can give true meaning to blessings. Just as in Egypt, God continues to call us to free our hearts from the gods we unconsciously worship. The plague of frogs reveals that God not only confronts Egypt's gods but also exposes human fragility in the face of idolatry. What man celebrates without measure can become a cause of ruin. By turning the symbol of fertility into chaos, God shows that true life is not in unrestrained multiplication but in trusting the Creator. Ultimately, this plague invites us to examine our own lives. What frogs are invading our spaces, turning blessings into burdens? After the waters turned into blood and the suffocating invasion of frogs, came the third plague, described in Exodus 8 verses 16 to 19. Unlike the previous two, which could still be seen as natural phenomena on a grand scale, this one was intimate, irritating, and impossible to ignore. Tiny insects, yet devastating. God commanded Aaron to strike the dust of the ground with his staff, and the dust turned into lice, or gnats, depending on the translation. They infested humans and animals throughout Egypt. The intensity was so great that even Pharaoh's magicians admitted, "This is the finger of God," Exodus 8 verse 19. For the first time, the experts in Egyptian enchantments and magic confessed their impotence before divine power. Translations vary. Some say lice, others gnats, or even fleas. The Hebrew term used is kinnim, which has no precise equivalent. The central point, however, is not the exact type of insect, but the overwhelming irritation they caused collectively. Imagine a swarm of parasites covering every part of the body, clinging to animals, clothing, and food. There was no hygiene, no rest, no relief. Unlike the first two plagues, which affected the environment, this one struck directly at the human body. For ancient Egypt, ritual purity was essential, especially for priests. They shaved their entire bodies, removed all hair, and followed strict hygiene rules in order to serve in the temples. The infestation of lice or gnats made ritual purity impossible. The priests, symbols of order and mediators with the gods, were incapacitated from officiating. In other words, this plague was not only physical but also spiritual. God disrupted Egyptian worship, proving that their gods were powerless before him. Up to this point, the Egyptian magicians had been able to imitate the plagues, multiplying problems rather than solving them. But in the third plague, they failed completely. Their confession was significant. This is the finger of God. In the ancient world, the expression finger of God meant direct, undeniable divine intervention. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Here we see a striking contrast. Egypt's specialists recognized God's power, but the ruler's heart refused to bow. The third plague carries profound messages. The dust of the earth becomes judgment. The very dust with which God formed man, Genesis 2 verse 7, now produced irritating insects. A reminder that creation, when corrupted, can turn against humanity. God humbles false religion. The Egyptian priestly system, built upon ritual purity, was paralyzed. No ritual, magic, or sacrifice could cleanse them from this infestation. The limited power of magic. The Egyptian magicians admitted they had reached their limit. The finger of God revealed the difference between human tricks and divine power. Some scholars suggest that, after the massive death of fish and the proliferation of frogs, first and second plagues, the environment became ideal for insect infestation. Stagnant water, decomposing animals, and heat could have created perfect conditions for gnats or parasites. From a natural perspective, this seems plausible. Yet once again, what the text emphasizes is not the how, but the when. The perfect timing and progression of the plagues reveal they were not mere climatic coincidences, but acts directed by the hand of God. Egypt, proud of its order and cleanliness, was plunged into impurity and discomfort. The body, the temple of life and the channel of connection with the gods, was now covered in irritating parasites. It was as if God were declaring, "Even what you consider control over your very own skin is subject to my will." This humiliation struck directly at Egypt's cultural and religious pride. The power of the small. The first plagues involved grand elements, rivers, frogs and multitudes, but now God used something tiny to paralyze an entire nation. This reminds us that it is not the size of the tool but the power of the one who wields it. Human impotence. The magicians reached the limit of their ability. Their confession is a call for us to reflect. How far can science, technology, and human resources really go when faced with existential and spiritual crises? The disturbance that awakens. Sometimes God allows small irritations in our lives to capture our attention. What disturbs us may be a divine warning to look beyond appearances. In our era, we rely heavily on our ability to control everything. Health, environment, body, time. But the third plague reminds us that something as small as an insect can shatter that illusion of control. An invisible virus, as we recently witnessed during the pandemic, can paralyze the entire world. The message of Exodus is that behind every crisis lies the opportunity to recognize our fragility and lift our eyes back to God. Just as the magicians declared, "This is the finger of God," we too are invited to discern when life situations are spiritual wake-up calls. The third plague is the first in which Egypt's own experts surrendered, admitting there was something beyond their ability to replicate or control. The insects, so small, exposed human arrogance and the impotence of false religion. God demonstrated that he could use even the dust of the ground to reveal his power. The lesson remains clear. Even the smallest of instruments, in the hands of the Creator, can become a powerful sign to expose human fragility and divine greatness. After the suffocating invasion of frogs and the plague of lice or gnats, comes the fourth plague, described in Exodus 8 verses 20 to 32. The text recounts that swarms of flies invaded homes, palaces, and even the very ground of Egypt, filling the land with corruption and filth. But there is a special detail that makes this plague unique. For the first time, God makes a clear distinction between Egypt and Israel. God commands Moses to meet Pharaoh in the morning and deliver the message once again. "Let my people go, so that they may serve me." Otherwise, swarms of flies would fill the entire land of Egypt, except for the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. The plague unfolds just as announced. Swarms take over houses, Pharaoh's palace, and the whole land. Egypt plunges into despair. Pharaoh, once again under pressure, tries to negotiate with Moses, offering the possibility for Israel to sacrifice within Egypt itself. But Moses rejects the proposal, insisting that the people must go into the wilderness. Pharaoh promises to allow it, but soon goes back on his word once the flies are removed. In Egyptian culture, insects also carried spiritual associations. Some scholars suggest that this plague may have been aimed at protective deities connected with nature and fertility. Yet the overwhelming presence of flies symbolized impurity, disorder, and corruption. While the third plague, lice/gnats, had already challenged the ritual purity system, the fourth intensified the chaos, now invading social and domestic life. Nothing was clean. Nothing was safe. The notion that Egypt was a land of order, governed by Marat, the cosmic order sustained by Pharaoh, was shattered by the chaotic invasion of insects. The most striking aspect of this plague is not just the annoyance of the swarms, but the fact that God makes a visible distinction between his people and Egypt. While the Egyptians suffered the invasion, Goshen had no flies. This separation carries profound theological meaning. Protection of God's people. The Lord not only judges, but also preserves those who belong to him. A sign for Pharaoh, the plague was not a mere natural phenomenon but a selective judgment. Foreshadowing of Passover. Just as the Israelites were spared from the flies, soon they would be spared from the death of the firstborn by the blood of the Lamb. This distinction shows that the purpose of the plagues was not indiscriminate destruction, but revelation and deliverance. From a natural standpoint, some scholars suggest that after the earlier plagues, Egypt's environment became conducive to insect swarms. The decomposition of dead animals, ecological imbalance, and heat could have produced clouds of flies or even biting insects like horseflies, known for spreading disease. Nevertheless, the biblical text emphasizes that the plague was miraculous in nature. It struck only the Egyptians, sparing Israel. This selectivity breaks any merely natural explanation and points to the hand of God guiding the events. The flies were not only a nuisance but also dangerous. They carried disease, contaminated food, and destroyed quality of life. The text says the land was ruined because of them, Exodus 8 verse 24. The invasion of swarms disrupted Egypt's public health, hygiene, and food security. More than that, it represented cultural humiliation. The most powerful empire of its time, proud of its order and prosperity, was reduced to filth and despair. Faced with the plague, Pharaoh finally makes a concession. He offers Israel the chance to sacrifice within Egypt. But Moses refuses, explaining that the Hebrews' sacrifices would be detestable to the Egyptians and could provoke conflict. This issue goes beyond logistics. It is a matter of spiritual identity. God's people could not serve him on Pharaoh's terms. True liberation would only come through full obedience. This moment shows us that Pharaoh attempted to bargain with God, but the divine answer was clear. There is no middle ground between freedom and slavery. The fourth plague teaches profound lessons. God distinguishes his own. The plague reveals his sovereignty in separating those who belong to him, preserving them even in chaos. God exposes human fragility. Egypt, symbol of power and order, was plunged into filth and disorder. God does not accept partial negotiations. Israel's liberation could not be halfway. The same applies to our spiritual life. We cannot serve two masters. Today we live in an era that prizes social, technological, and economic order. We trust in systems, governments, and even invisible structures that promise stability. But the fourth plague reminds us that something seemingly small and uncontrollable, a swarm, or even a virus, can expose our vulnerability. Moreover, this plague speaks to the issue of identity. How often do we try to compromise our faith to accommodate the Pharaoh of our times? Whether that be culture, system, or fear. The story shows that true freedom only happens when we stop negotiating with what enslaves us and choose total obedience to God. The fourth plague marks a turning point in the narrative. For the first time, God clearly distinguishes between Egypt and Israel, proving that his action was not random but purposeful. Egypt is plunged into filth and disorder, while Goshen remains untouched. This episode teaches us that in the midst of chaos, God is able to protect and set apart his people. But it also challenges us to abandon half-hearted negotiations with the pharaohs of our day and embrace the full freedom that only he can provide. Up to this point, the plagues had already shaken the religious, social, and hygienic foundations of Egypt. But now, in the fifth plague, the blow strikes directly at the economy and livelihood. In Exodus 9 verses 1-7, God announces that he will send a pestilence upon Egypt's animals, horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep, bringing unprecedented economic devastation. The Lord commands Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go, so that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let them go, the hand of the Lord will be upon your livestock." The plague is selective. Only the Egyptians' livestock die, while Israel's herds in Goshen remain untouched. The very next day, what had been announced is fulfilled precisely. All the Egyptians' animals are struck, but the herds of Israel suffer no harm. The value of livestock in ancient Egypt. In Egypt, livestock was not only a source of food, but also of labor and a symbol of wealth. Oxen and cows were used for plowing, transport, and trade. To lose livestock meant losing the economic foundation of the nation. Beyond its practical value, cattle also held religious significance. Egypt revered deities linked to cattle, such as Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, and Hathor, the cow goddess associated with fertility and maternal love. Destroying the livestock was therefore a direct strike against both Egypt's economic pride and its religious identity. The fifth plague reveals profound spiritual truths. God judges the economic foundations of oppression. Egypt relied on its agricultural and military strength. God demonstrates that even these are subject to his will. The hand of the Lord. The text stresses that this was not random, but the direct hand of the Lord at work. The distinction between Egypt and Israel. Once again, God clearly separates his people, protecting them while judgment falls upon the oppressors. Historically, some theories suggest that the plague may have been an epidemic among livestock, spread by mosquitoes, horseflies, or contaminated waters from the previous plagues. Archaeologists and historians note that livestock plagues were known in ancient Egypt, sometimes wiping out entire herds. Diseases such as anthrax and rinderpest could have caused mass deaths. Yet the central point is not the scientific explanation, but the timing and selectivity. The Egyptians' animals died while Israel's remained unharmed. This highlights the miraculous and purposeful nature of divine judgment. Livestock was essential for agriculture. Oxen pulled plows and carts. Food, meat, milk, and dairy products were staples. Religion. Animals were offered in sacrifices and revered as sacred. Trade. Livestock was a form of wealth and exchange. The destruction of herds shattered not only the economy but also the people's confidence in the protection of their gods. It was a direct blow against Egypt's self-sufficiency. The bull Apis was one of the most important symbols of Egyptian religion, representing strength, fertility, and divine power. He was worshipped in dedicated temples and considered the earthly manifestation of Ptah, the creator god. The goddess Hathor, associated with the cow, symbolized motherhood, joy, and music. Her image was central in temples and festivals. By striking the livestock, God showed that even Egypt's most revered deities could not protect what was supposedly consecrated to them. The message was clear: no idol can save when the Lord chooses to judge. What sustains our lives can collapse. Just as livestock sustained Egypt, we all have something we consider essential: finances, jobs, property. The plague reminds us that nothing is absolute except God. God does not act by chance. His actions are targeted. He did not destroy Israel's herds, only Egypt's. Divine judgment is just and specific, not blind or random. The hardening of the heart. Even after catastrophic economic loss, Pharaoh did not yield. This reveals the spiritual reality of the human heart. It can lose wealth, possessions, and status yet still resist God's voice. In our society, the economy plays the central role that livestock once did in Egypt. We measure success, security, and even identity through money, production, and consumption. The fifth plague calls us to reflect. What if everything we rely on economically suddenly collapsed? As in financial crises, pandemics, and systemic failures, we realize that our security cannot rest in possessions or human structures. God continues to remind his people, "Your life does not depend on what you own, but on me." The fifth plague struck at the very heart of Egypt's economy and exposed the impotence of the bull and cow deities. Egypt lost its economic and religious foundation, while Israel remained untouched. This episode shows that God is sovereign over both material and spiritual life, and that no wealth or idol can withstand his power. More than an ancient story, it is an invitation to examine where we place our trust and to remember that only God is the true source of security and provision. If until now the plagues had struck the water, the animals, and the economy, the judgment now becomes even more intimate and painful: the human body itself. In Exodus 9 verses 8 to 12, we find the sixth plague, when God commands Moses and Aaron to take ashes from a furnace and throw them into the air before Pharaoh. The ashes turn into fine dust that spreads throughout Egypt, causing boils and sores on humans and animals alike. This plague not only brings physical pain but also deeply affects the religious and cultural sphere of Egypt, challenging its notions of purity, health, and power. The account is straightforward. Moses and Aaron take ashes and throw them into the air before Pharaoh. They spread like fine dust, and soon people and animals across Egypt are covered with boils and sores. The striking detail is that the Egyptian magicians, who had once imitated the plagues, now cannot even stand before Moses, for they too are covered with the sores. Here we witness the definitive collapse of Egyptian magic before the power of the God of Israel. The ashes thrown into the air carry powerful symbolic meaning. In Egypt, furnaces were used for common tasks, such as brickmaking, in which the Hebrews were enslaved, as well as for ritual purposes. Some scholars suggest that the image of ashes cast into the wind may echo pagan cursing rituals, in which dust was scattered into the air to symbolize the spreading of a spell. God uses this gesture to demonstrate that it is not human rituals that determine destiny, but his sovereign hand. What was once seen as a sign of magical power becomes an instrument of divine judgment. Ancient Egypt placed high value on physical purity, especially among its priests. To serve in the temples, they shaved all their body hair, bathed daily, and upheld strict standards of hygiene. Skin diseases, wounds, or deformities made them impure and unfit for service. The sixth plague therefore had a devastating impact. Neither priests, nor magicians, nor even Pharaoh himself could escape physical contamination. It was as if God declared, "Even the body you believe you control is subject to my judgment." Furthermore, many Egyptian deities were associated with healing and medicine, such as Isis, linked to health and magic, and Sekhmet, goddess of war but also protector against epidemics. By sending incurable sores, God showed that even these revered deities had no real power over health. Some scholars suggest the boils may have been the result of cutaneous anthrax, caused by contact with the dead livestock from the fifth plague. Others point to insect-borne diseases, such as those transmitted by flies and mosquitoes that would have proliferated after the environmental breakdown caused by the earlier plagues. While these theories may have scientific plausibility, the central point remains. The plague occurred in a logical sequence, yet on a supernatural scale and with selectivity. The text highlights that the magicians could not even stand before Moses, underscoring human impotence before divine power. Verse 12 carries a solemn note. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them. Up to this point, the text often said that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Now, we see that the hardening itself is also part of divine judgment. This raises a profound theological question. To what extent does a human reject God's voice, and at what point does that rejection itself become judgment? The sixth plague shows us that there is a limit to human obstinacy, when deliberate refusal to obey transforms into a self-imposed condemnation. The sixth plague delivers messages that echo even today. The fragility of the human body. No matter how much one relies on health or appearance, a single illness is enough to expose human vulnerability. The failure of false religion. The magicians who once tried to replicate the signs are now rendered powerless. God exposes the inability of false spiritual systems to offer real solutions. The limit of hardening. Pharaoh's resistance reminds us that repeatedly rejecting God's voice hardens the heart to the point of no return. We live in a society obsessed with the body, health, beauty, longevity. We invest billions in diets, medicines, exercise, surgeries. Yet the sixth plague reminds us that the body, however well cared for, remains fragile in the face of the mystery of life and death. This reality does not call us to despair, but to humility. The Apostle Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 16 that, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. The sixth plague calls us not to place our ultimate trust in physical strength, but in the spiritual renewal that comes from God. Moreover, the inability of Egypt's magicians and gods to heal the sores points to a modern truth. We often look for solutions in systems, philosophies, and even alternative spiritualities, but only in God do we find true healing for both body and soul. The sixth plague marks a decisive turning point. Not only the environment and economy are shaken, but now the human body itself is struck. Neither priests, nor magicians, nor Pharaoh escape the sores that disfigure and humiliate. God demonstrates that every form of human power, economic, religious, or physical, is limited before his sovereignty. More than an ancient plague, this episode reminds us that our lives cannot rest on health, appearance, or human systems, but only on the God who heals, restores, and sets free. After 6 devastating plagues that had already shaken Egypt's economy, religion, and even the human body, the 7th plague arrives, described in Exodus 9 verses 13 to 35. Here, the narrative takes on an even more dramatic tone. God sends a storm of hail mixed with fire, something unprecedented in Egypt. This plague not only brings material destruction, but also offers a clearer revelation of God's sovereignty over nature and Pharaoh's hardened heart. Once again, Moses is instructed to go before Pharaoh and declare, "This time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth." Exodus 9 verse 14. God announces a storm so devastating that it would destroy humans, animals, and crops. Yet he provides an opportunity for protection. Those who feared the word of the Lord could bring their servants and animals into shelters and spare them from destruction. The text reports that some of Pharaoh's officials feared the word of the Lord and sheltered their servants, while others ignored it and suffered the consequences. When the storm came, it devastated Egypt. Trees, crops, and livestock were destroyed. Only the land of Goshen, where Israel lived, remained untouched. Egypt, known for its hot and dry climate, rarely saw heavy rains, let alone hail mixed with fire. This supernatural detail indicates not merely a natural storm but an extraordinary event. Hail, a symbol of agricultural destruction, combined with fire, suggests a direct manifestation of divine wrath. The text emphasizes, "Never had there been anything like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation." Exodus 9 verse 24. This plague marks an escalation in intensity. God not only disrupts daily life but also destroys Egypt's agricultural foundation. Barley and flax, essential for food and clothing, are wiped out. The message is clear: Egypt's sustenance did not depend on its gods but on the hand of the Lord. For the first time, there is also a call to decision. The Egyptians could protect themselves if they heeded God's word. Here, judgment is accompanied by mercy. offering a chance for response and faith. This plague carries strong religious overtones. Among Egypt's deities were Nut, goddess of the sky; Shu, god of the air; Tefnut, goddess of moisture; Seth, associated with storms and chaos. By sending hail and fire, God demonstrated that none of these deities had control over the heavens and weather. Only the Creator rules over the elements of nature. Archaeologists and scholars suggest that severe storms could, on rare occasions, strike Egypt, especially from the Mediterranean. Hail, while uncommon, was possible. Yet the association with fire suggests a supernatural element. Some interpret the fire as lightning accompanying the storm. Even if natural explanations exist, the central point remains the precision of the judgment. Its intensity, its selectivity, affecting only Egypt, and its direct connection to Moses' prophetic word. Faced with destruction, Pharaoh admits for the first time, "This time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong." Exodus 9 verse 27. Yet this confession is superficial. Once the storm ceases, he hardens his heart again. Here we see a portrait of human nature. In the midst of crisis, we recognize our fragility and even confess our fault. But when the pressure passes, we often return to old patterns. Judgment with an opportunity for grace. God announces the plague but offers escape to those who heed his word. Even in judgment, there is mercy. God's sovereignty over nature. The climate, which the Egyptians attributed to their gods, is revealed as an instrument of the Lord. False confession. Pharaoh acknowledges sin but does not truly repent. This highlights the difference between superficial confession and genuine repentance. Today we also live under the threat of natural disasters. Droughts, floods, hurricanes, wildfires. Many of these are linked to environmental imbalance caused by humanity itself. The seventh plague invites us to reflect. Do we see crises merely as natural disasters, or as calls to humility before God? Another contemporary issue is false confession. How often, in times of difficulty, do we make promises to God or acknowledge our weakness, only to return to our routine unchanged once the problem passes? This plague warns us of the need for true repentance that produces transformation. The seventh plague inaugurates a new stage in the cycle of judgments. The sky, source of life and order for Egypt, becomes an instrument of destruction. Hail and fire expose the impotence of the Egyptian gods, destabilize the economy, and directly challenge Pharaoh. But they also reveal God's mercy. Those who heeded his word could find protection. And here lies the eternal lesson. Even in the midst of judgment, God offers refuge to those who trust in him. After the devastation caused by hail and fire, Egypt was still trying to recover. Some crops had survived the destruction, especially wheat and spelt, which matured later. But then, in Exodus 10 verses 1 to 20, God sends the eighth plague, a massive swarm of locusts that covers the land and devours everything that remained. This plague not only completed the agricultural ruin of Egypt, but also carried a deep symbolic and spiritual weight, echoing as one of the most feared judgments in all biblical history. God commands Moses once again to go before Pharaoh and declare, "Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will bring locusts into your country tomorrow. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen, and they will devour what little you have left after the hail." Exodus 10 verses 3 to 5. Pharaoh's officials, now desperate, plead, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord." Pharaoh then tries to negotiate, allowing only the men to leave, but Moses refuses. The whole people must serve God. When Moses stretches out his staff, the east wind brings the locusts, which invade all of Egypt, covering the land so completely that the ground seems to disappear beneath them. Nothing green remains. Trees, crops, herbs, everything is consumed. In the Bible and other Middle Eastern traditions, locusts are often associated with divine judgment and mass destruction. In the book of Joel, for example, they symbolize the devastation caused by the army of the Lord, Joel 1 verse 4, 2:25. In Revelation, they appear again as an image of end times judgment, Revelation 9. For the Egyptians, the arrival of locusts was a familiar terror. In an agricultural civilization, such a plague meant famine, misery, and social collapse. The eighth plague therefore touches one of humanity's oldest fears, losing the means of life in an uncontrollable way. This plague also carried a spiritual dimension. Egypt revered many deities linked to harvest and fertility, such as Osiris, associated with vegetation and rebirth, and Nippur, god of grain. By allowing locusts to consume all food, God exposed the impotence of these gods. The message is clear. It is not idols or natural forces that guarantee life's sustenance, but the sovereign Lord. Locust plagues are still known today in North Africa and the Middle East. Swarms can travel hundreds of miles and destroy entire harvests in just hours. There are historical records of swarms so dense they blocked out the sun. However, the biblical account highlights supernatural elements. The exact timing: they arrived the very next day after Moses' word. The intensity: never before had Egypt experienced such a devastating plague. God's control: when Moses prayed, a strong west wind carried the locusts into the Red Sea, ending the plague immediately. These details show that even if God used natural phenomena, the event was marked by his direct and sovereign intervention. If the hail had already destroyed part of the harvest, the locusts consumed what was left. This meant imminent famine, unemployment, and the collapse of the agricultural economy. Egypt, once known for its abundance and for being the breadbasket of the ancient world, was now ruined. Food reserves and security were at risk. Its pride as a fertile land was turned into humiliation. Once again under pressure, Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron and admits, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly plague away from me." Exodus 10 verses 16 to 17. Yet his confession is again superficial. He seeks only immediate relief, with no real willingness to obey. When the locusts are removed, Pharaoh hardens his heart once more. Provision comes from God. The plague shows that land and agriculture are not under human control or false gods, but under divine providence. The weight of idolatry: Egypt trusted its gods for fertility, but they were powerless before the Lord's action. The insufficiency of superficial faith: Pharaoh confesses and asks for prayer but does not change his ways. This reflects religiosity that seeks only quick fixes without true commitment to God. Today, we may not face locust swarms like ancient Egypt, though they still exist in some regions, but we face other modern plagues that threaten our sustenance: economic crises, inflation, climate disasters affecting crops and supply chains. The eighth plague reminds us that there is no absolute security in human economic systems or agriculture. Our ultimate dependence is not on technology or the global economy, but on the God who sustains life. It also warns us against a utilitarian faith. How often do we seek God only as an emergency solution, without genuine surrender? Like Pharaoh, we risk recognizing our fragility in crisis but hardening our hearts once the danger passes. The eighth plague completed Egypt's ruin, destroying the crops and plunging the nation into despair. More than a natural disaster, it was a supernatural sign of God's sovereignty, showing that He is the true Lord of life's provision. This plague teaches us that in times of scarcity and insecurity, our trust must not rest in human systems but in the one who can provide in every circumstance. And it challenges us to live out a genuine faith, not only in moments of crisis but at all times. After the devastation of the crops by hail and locusts, Egypt sinks into an even more distressing experience. The ninth plague, described in Exodus 10 verses 21 to 29. This time, there is no destruction of animals or plants, but something deeper: the absence of light. For 3 days, thick darkness covered the land, so dense that the Egyptians could not see one another nor leave their houses. Meanwhile, the Israelites in the land of Goshen continued to enjoy light. This contrast powerfully reveals that the plague was not merely a natural phenomenon but a supernatural act of the God who is light. The Lord commands Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt." Exodus 10 verse 21. The text emphasizes the density of the darkness, as if it were tangible. For 3 days, the Egyptians were paralyzed, unable to carry out their daily activities. It is difficult to imagine the fear, isolation, and anguish of that period. At the same time, Israel continued to live normally, with light in their dwellings. This distinction underscores that God was acting selectively, protecting his people while judging Egypt. In biblical symbolism, darkness represents the absence of God's presence. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. 1 John 1 verse 5. Chaos and disorder, a reminder of the state of the earth before creation, when darkness was over the surface of the deep. Genesis 1 verse 2. Spiritual judgment. Darkness is associated with separation from God, like the weeping and gnashing of teeth Jesus described. In the Egyptian context, this plague was a direct affront to Ra, the sun god, one of Egypt's most important deities. Pharaoh was considered the son of Ra and his earthly representative. When the light disappeared, it was as if God declared, "Not even your greatest God can resist my will." Unlike the previous plagues, which had physical and economic consequences, this one struck directly at the psychological and spiritual core. Imagine 3 days of thick darkness. Social paralysis. No one left home. No one worked. No gatherings. Fear and despair. Darkness symbolized abandonment and judgment. Absolute isolation. In a culture accustomed to the constant brightness of the sun, darkness meant the complete inversion of the natural order. While Egypt endured this psychological collapse, Israel enjoyed peace in the light. This showed that the same God who judges is also the one who protects and sustains his people. Some scholars suggest that the plague could have been caused by a sandstorm, common in Egypt and called Khamsin, which can darken the sky for hours or even days. Others point to distant volcanic eruptions that could have filled the atmosphere with ash and dust. Yet the biblical text highlights supernatural elements. The exact duration of 3 days. Darkness that could be felt. Far more intense than a mere storm. The absolute contrast between Egypt and Goshen, which can only be explained as divine intervention. Confronted with the plague, Pharaoh proposes another bargain. He would allow the people to leave with their families, but their livestock must remain in Egypt. Moses refuses, insisting that the people must take everything, including their animals, to serve the Lord. This moment marks the climax of Pharaoh's resistance. Furious, he declares, "Get out of my sight! Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face you will die." Exodus 10 verse 28. Moses replies firmly, "Just as you say, I will never appear before you again." Exodus 10 verse 29. This dialogue seals the final rupture. Pharaoh's heart is fully hardened, and the way is prepared for the 10th and last plague. God is Lord of light and darkness. The plague demonstrates that cosmic order does not belong to Pharaoh or Ra, but to the Creator. Darkness as spiritual judgment. The absence of light points to the reality of separation from God, a condition of despair and death. The distinction between God's people and the world. Israel remains in the light, while Egypt is engulfed in darkness. This symbolizes the difference between those who live in God's presence and those who reject his voice. Today, we may not face physical darkness as in Egypt, but many live in spiritual darkness. Despair, lack of purpose, alienation from God. The 9th plague reminds us that the greatest darkness is not the absence of the sun, but the absence of God's presence. By contrast, Jesus declared, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." John 8 verse 12. Just as Israel had light in Goshen, all who trust in Christ are called to walk in the light, even in a world immersed in spiritual darkness. The 9th plague strikes at the very heart of Egyptian identity, confronting Ra, the sun god, and Pharaoh himself. For 3 days, Egypt experienced chaos, fear, and isolation in absolute darkness, while Israel remained protected by the light. This episode reminds us that true light is not guaranteed by the sun or human systems, but by the presence of God. It challenges us to choose, to live in the light of Christ or remain in the spiritual darkness that leads away from true life. No other moment in the story of the plagues is as solemn and filled with symbolism as the 10th plague, narrated in Exodus 11 to 12. Here, Egypt experiences the most severe judgment, the death of the firstborn, from Pharaoh's son to the slave's son, from humans to animals. At the same time, Israel receives the institution of the Passover, the ritual that would mark not only their deliverance from Egypt but also their entire identity as God's people. This plague is the climax of the entire narrative. the final rupture between Pharaoh and Israel, the decisive judgment of God over Egypt, and the revelation of the redemption plan that would ultimately be fulfilled centuries later on the cross of Christ. Moses announces to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the servant girl behind the millstone, and all the firstborn of the animals." Exodus 11 verses 4-5. That night, the angel of the Lord went throughout Egypt, and a great cry rose up, for there was no house without mourning. However, among the Israelites, no harm came, for they had obeyed God's command to sacrifice a lamb, mark their doorposts with its blood, and eat the Passover meal. The 10th plague is inseparable from the institution of the Passover, Pasach. God commands each Israelite family to sacrifice a spotless lamb, a 1-year-old male, and mark the doors of their homes with its blood. Upon seeing the blood, the angel of death would pass over that household, sparing the firstborn. The blood as a sign of life and protection. It was not Israel's merit or strength that saved them, but the blood of the lamb. The communal meal, eating the roasted lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, was an act of unity and preparation for departure. The eternal memorial. The Passover was not just for that night, but was to be celebrated from generation to generation as a remembrance of deliverance. The whole of Egypt was plunged into mourning. From Pharaoh's palace to the humblest homes, there was no exception. The firstborn, in many ancient cultures, represented inheritance, continuity, and the future. The death of the firstborn symbolized not only personal loss but also the collapse of Egypt's legacy and security. For Pharaoh, it was the most devastating blow. His heir to the throne, regarded as divine, was not spared. This showed that even the royal lineage was not beyond the reach of God's judgment. The text emphasizes the cry of Egypt that night, a collective lament of grief and helplessness. It was the culmination of divine judgment over a nation that had enslaved and humiliated Israel. This plague was a direct affront not only to Pharaoh but to all the gods of Egypt. The Lord declares in Exodus 12 verse 12, "I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord." Pharaoh, regarded as divine, was powerless to save his own son. The gods who supposedly protected life and fertility could not prevent death. Egypt, which placed its security in dynastic continuity and ancestor worship, was confronted with the absolute sovereignty of God over life and death. The 10th plague reveals central truths. God's judgment is universal and just, from Pharaoh to the slave. No one is exempt. Salvation comes through obedience to the blood. Israel was not spared by merit, but because they were under the sign of the Lamb's blood. Redemption requires substitution. An innocent lamb dies in the place of the firstborn. Here lies the foreshadowing of the gospel. Christ, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world, John 1 verse 29. In antiquity, the death of firstborns appears in other cultures as a sign of divine judgment. In Egypt, the firstborn was especially significant, ensuring family continuity and, in Pharaoh's case, dynastic succession. Archaeologists and scholars suggest naturalistic explanations, such as environmental disasters, contamination of the Nile, death of fish, proliferation of insects, and epidemics that may have disproportionately affected the youngest and most vulnerable. Yet, the biblical account insists this was no random tragedy but a direct act of God, carried out with selectivity and profound spiritual meaning. With the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh finally relents. He summons Moses and Aaron during the night and says, "Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." Exodus 12 verses 31-32. In desperation, Egypt urges Israel to leave quickly, giving them gold, silver, and clothing. The people set out toward freedom, fulfilling the promise God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All are under judgment. Just as Egypt, all humanity is subject to divine judgment. The blood is the only protection. The blood of the Lamb was the sign of salvation that night. Today, it is the blood of Christ that delivers us from condemnation. True deliverance requires obedience. Israel was protected because they obeyed God's instructions. Faith and obedience go hand in hand. Pharaoh represents the hardened human heart, despite 9 previous signs, he refused to yield until the ultimate limit. This illustrates the danger of hardening one's heart against God's voice. The 10th plague continues to echo today, not only as a historical episode but as a spiritual mirror. We live in a world that still resists God's voice, like Pharaoh. We place our trust in lineage, wealth, or systems, but in the end, all of us need redemption. The blood of the Lamb in the Exodus points directly to the blood of Christ on the cross. Just as the Israelites had to be under the blood to escape death, so must we be covered by Christ's sacrifice to inherit eternal life. The death of the firstborn was the most severe judgment upon Egypt and the final blow against Pharaoh. But for Israel, it was the night of deliverance, marked by the blood of the Lamb and the institution of the Passover. This episode encapsulates the heart of the biblical message. Judgment and salvation go hand in hand. The same God who judges sin is the God who offers a way of escape through the blood. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul would write, "Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed for us." 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7. Thus, the 10th plague is not merely a past event, but a prophetic foreshadowing of the ultimate redemption in Jesus Christ. The narrative of the 10 plagues of Egypt is not merely an account of ancient catastrophes. It is a story filled with symbolism, theological revelation, and spiritual lessons that still resonate today. Each plague was a surgical strike against Egypt's economy, religion, culture, and pride. Yet beyond judgment, the account reveals God's mercy and faithfulness in delivering his people. In this conclusion, we will reflect on the historical, cultural, theological, and spiritual meanings of the plagues, exploring their legacy for Israel, for the Christian faith, and for contemporary life. First and foremost, the plagues are presented as acts of judgment. Pharaoh had enslaved Israel for centuries, hardened his heart, and repeatedly defied God's command. The plagues exposed the justice of God, who does not allow oppression and injustice to last forever. But the plagues were not only judgment, they were also instruments of deliverance. Each strike against Egypt was, at the same time, a step toward Israel's freedom. The people who had been in bondage were now walking toward becoming a free nation, destined to serve the Lord. This duality, judgment for some, deliverance for others, runs throughout the Bible. The same God who judges oppressors is the one who liberates captives. Each plague was a direct assault on Egypt's pantheon. The Nile, turned to blood, struck Hapi, the god of the river. The frogs attacked Hecate, goddess of fertility. The lice and gnats humiliated the priests and their belief in ritual purity. The flies, livestock disease, and boils exposed the impotence of deities such as Apis and Hathor. The hail and fire showed that not even Nut, goddess of the sky, could protect Egypt. The locusts devastated Osiris, god of vegetation. The darkness defied Ra, the sun god, the greatest of all. The death of the firstborn struck Pharaoh himself, considered divine. Thus, the plagues were a systematic deconstruction of Egyptian polytheism. The Lord was not just another god in the contest, but the one true God, sovereign over every aspect of life and creation. While Egypt was judged, Israel experienced divine protection. In several plagues, especially from the 4th onward, God distinguished Egypt from the land of Goshen, showing that his people would not be harmed. But the climax of this distinction came in the 10th plague, with the institution of the Passover. The flawless lamb, sacrificed in place of the firstborn, became the symbol of redemption. The blood on the doorposts was the sign of salvation. This celebration would shape Israel's identity for generations. Every year, at Passover, the Israelites would remember that they were slaves, but God delivered them with a mighty hand. More than a memory, it was a pedagogical act to ensure they never forgot they belonged to the Lord. The narrative of the plagues prophetically points to the work of Christ. The New Testament presents Jesus as the Lamb of God, John 1 verse 29, whose death on the cross fulfills the symbol of Passover. Just as the Israelites were saved from death by the Lamb's blood on their doorframes, Christians believe they are saved from eternal condemnation by the blood of Christ. Paul affirms, Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us, 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7. The 10th plague, therefore, is not only an episode of the past but a foreshadowing of the gospel. Judgment for those who resist, salvation for those who trust in the blood of the Lamb. Each plague carries lessons that transcend time and remain relevant today. First plague, water to blood, reminds us that what we idolize can turn into death and sorrow. Second, frogs, shows how blessings without limits can become burdens. Third, lice, reveals how even the smallest nuisance exposes human fragility. Fourth, flies, teaches that God distinguishes those who belong to him. Fifth, livestock disease, warns that our economy and wealth can collapse. Sixth, boils, reminds us of the frailty of the human body. Seventh, hail and fire, shows that even the heavens are under God's control. Eighth, locusts, highlights the futility of trusting solely in human productivity. Ninth, darkness, reveals the spiritual blindness of life without God. 10th, death of the firstborn, teaches that salvation comes only through the Lamb's blood. A recurring theme in the narrative is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. In some passages, the text says he hardened his own heart. In others, that the Lord hardened it. This raises a profound theological question. To what extent does a human choose to resist God, and at what point does that resistance become divine judgment? The message is clear. The more we resist God's voice, the more desensitized we become, until our hearts close completely. Pharaoh embodies the person who repeatedly rejects God's call until no return is left. Many scholars seek archaeological evidence for the plagues. Some hypothesize that they may have been triggered by a chain of natural disasters. The contamination of the Nile, proliferation of frogs and insects, outbreaks of disease, and extreme climate phenomena. Others suggest connections with volcanic eruptions or agricultural plagues recorded in other civilizations. Yet even if natural elements played a role, the biblical narrative insists on the supernatural and theological dimension. The precise timing of the events, their unprecedented intensity, the clear distinction between Egypt and Israel. Rather than seeking purely scientific explanations, archaeology and history confirm that the narrative reflects a plausible ancient context, but one understood as the direct act of Israel's God. The plagues are not only past events, but also symbols of challenges we still face today. Environmental crises, polluted waters, ruined harvests, climate change, diseases and epidemics, reminders of human fragility, economic collapses, revealing the instability of wealth, spiritual darkness, the emptiness of life without God. Just as in Egypt, our era is marked by modern plagues that expose our weakness and challenge our false gods. Technology, money, power, pleasure. The narrative invites us to reflect. Where have we placed our trust? The legacy of the 10 plagues is the revelation that God is Lord of history. He acts in time and space, judging oppressors, delivering captives, and guiding his people toward redemption. For Israel, the plagues were the definitive proof that God is faithful to his promises. For Christians, they point to Christ, the Passover Lamb. For us today, they remain a call to faith, humility, and trust in God amid the crises of the world. The 10 plagues of Egypt are not just an epic tale of the past, but a living parable about God's power, human frailty, and the need for redemption. Egypt, with all its glory and gods, was humbled. Israel, with all its weakness as slaves, was exalted and delivered. At the center of it all is the God who acts with both judgment and mercy, who destroys idols yet saves those who trust in his blood. Today, the message endures. We can either live like Egypt, resisting God's voice to the end, or like Israel, covered by the Lamb's blood, walking toward freedom. If this message touched your heart, support our work. Like this video, subscribe to the Secrets of the Bible channel, and share it. In this way, more people will be able to know the transforming truths of the Word of Christ.